Hey.
They want to start the stream now. Are you?
Yeah, I mean, I've gone live on my thing. So there we go. It's live on their thing.
Okay, cool.
It's live on the YouTube. I don't know why it has this random background, though.
Is that on the YouTube? Oh, there you go.
There we go. So this is their YouTube. The Twitter is not gone live for some reason.
Maybe.
It's picking up. Mute the talkback.
That's weird.
Fuck me. Okay. Well, there's only 3 people watching, so I've got that.
Okay. Those are all muted.
Okay, I mean, I don't know why it's not live on Twitter. Edit channels.
Yeah, that looks fine.
It's on both of them, yeah.
Is that the? Oh no, that's undercurrents.
Should I just edit the Twitter one? If you unmute all of them.
Unmute them right now.
Yeah, I think so, because he said it's fine that we then hear like some stuff in the background. Oh, you know what?
Is this the Lady Gaga A Star Is Born song?
No. Yes.
Yeah, Shallow. Yeah. But in a-
It's quite
hard. This is presumably all about being filmed and put on the internet. Tough with a light on your eyes.
It is. Thank you so much.
Can't sit there like this, can we?
Right. Hello and welcome everyone to this Centre for Policy Studies event on Labour's Schools Bill, Pass or Fail. With me tonight to talk about the content of the bill and the thinking behind it, we have firstly Neil O'Brien, the MP for Harborough, Oadby and Wigston, and Shadow Minister for Education. We have Sir Daniel Moynihan, who is CEO of the Harris Academy Trust, a multi-academy trust covering 50 primary, secondary schools and sixth forms. We have Meg Powell-Chandler, a director of the New Schools Network, a former special advisor at the Department for Education and in number 10. And we have Mark Lehain, executive head teacher, at the Wootton Academy Trust, 2 stints at the Department for Education as a special advisor, and of course a former Centre for Policy Studies head of education. So the schools bill. We know that the schools revolution was in many ways the crowning achievement of the Cameron government. School standards have risen because of that, because of reforms based on freedom, parental choice, decentralisation, a knowledge-rich curriculum, phonics for learning to read. England went from, I think, 22nd to 9th in the world on maths, similar on reading, from 11th to 9th on science in the PISA tables, which is about as neutral and objective a measure as you can get. And you can see that this was really down to those reforms if you compare progress, or rather reversal, in Scotland and Wales. So today we face a very real prospect of Labour reversing these gains. So we're going to dig into what those reversals might look like, but hopefully also some thoughts on how to reverse the damage in the future. So the format today, each of the panelists is going to open with 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes of thoughts. Then we'll have discussion up here on some of the key themes, and then we'll have about 25 minutes for Q&A at the end. So on that note, Neil, could you start us off, please?
Oh, well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be on such an event where there's not just a distinguished panel, but a very, very distinguished audience as well, with a lot of knowledgeable people here. So thank you for having me. under last government, there was, I think, clear improvement in our schools. And our schools are better than when I was a child. And that is not an accident. It's a result of some proper public sector reforms. And as Carl alluded to, you can see from international league tables that while England schools went up those international league tables over the period since 2010, other places in the UK, like Wales and Scotland, that didn't have the same reforms, went backwards, and quite dramatically so. So, for example, on science, England went from 11th to 9th, while Wales went from 21st to 29th, right? Really big difference. And that is not because the teachers there don't try hard, and it's not because of other background factors. It's because of the reform. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies look at this, and they had a report called Major Challenges for Education in Wales. And they say, low scores in Wales can't be explained by high levels of poverty. In fact, in PISA, disadvantaged children in England score about 30 points higher on average than disadvantaged children in Wales. Even more remarkably, the performance of disadvantaged children in England is now either above or similar to the average for all children in Wales. So disadvantaged children in England now doing better than the average child in Wales. An incredible impact from the reforms. And yet those reforms, which as Carl said, were based on a combination of freedom for school leaders to do the right thing and freedom from bureaucracy, and on the other hand, accountability and our willingness to quickly change underperforming managers. That, broadly speaking, that guiding principle has been abandoned. And it was abandoned before the schools bill, and it's not just the schools bill that is a problem. The government had already abolished the Academy Conversion Grant, abolished the Trust Capacity Fund that helps grow the best families of school. It had paused the new round of free schools that the last government had signed off on, even though we can see that schools, free schools, are clearly performing above the national average in terms of their value added for their pupils. And the government has abolished lots of the other funding for school-led school improvement. So they've abolished anything that looks elitist for things like advanced maths, physics, Latin, computing, all these things we really need for the future are being abolished. And then you have, of course, the schools bill itself, which again sort of strikes at both those elements of both freedom and accountability. So it takes away freedoms, initially a huge grab to take away the Academy's freedoms over pay. Still lots of problems there insofar as pay freedoms over the other half of the workforce have not been the subject of a government U-turn. They're not offering the same principles of a floor, not a ceiling for school support staff, which is about half the workforce. Big reductions in freedom of recruitment and the requirement that everyone should have a qualified teacher status up front. And I know from a friend who is teaching at the moment in an inner London school that he just wouldn't have gone into it if there had been that extra bureaucracy, that opportunity to just start in state schools. An obstacle, by the way, that independent schools don't have. Taking away freedoms over the curriculum, which is difficult, I know, for a lot of schools that are trying to turn themselves around. Sometimes they narrow the focus for a time so that you can't go on to teach all the good, fancy stuff we all want to learn about if you can't read and write. Right? So sometimes you need to have that freedom to go a bit narrower for a while to fix things. And more generally, taking very, very sweeping powers in Clause 43 of the bill to be able to direct any academy school on any issue where the Secretary of State happens to think they're behaving unreasonably. And that is just a total power to do anything you want to any school, which is completely away from the spirit of freedom that have animated reform since the late 80s. And at the same time, as all this micromanagement is pouring forth, micromanagement like the requirement to go to the Secretary of State if you want to build a bike shed, an amazing thing in Clause 33 of the bill. There's also the end of those accountabilities. So we're going to get rid of the Academy's order that turns failing schools automatically into an academy. That was put in place partly because New Labour realised that the best way to turn around a failing school was to change the new management, and partly because there were so many local disputes where there were long-running court cases and the school's improvement got delayed for years on end, and that's why it was made automatic. And now the government, unfortunately, are unwinding that. And last but not least, the unwinding of a reform really from the late 1980s. In the 1987 Party Conference, Mrs. Thatcher, involved in the creation of CPS, announced that they would allow schools to expand without requiring the permission of local authorities. And this bill, in Clause 40, unwinds that for the first time. And these are reforms that worked. Right? Let me quote former Labour Education Minister, Lord Adonis, who talked about that school freedom to expand. And he said, local management of the schools was an unalloyed and almost immediate success. School budgets under LMS were based largely on pupil numbers, so parental choice came to matter as never before. And we had that consensus. We had Labour reformers like Adonis understanding that you needed structural change to get the results we want for deprived kids. And now, sadly, we seem to have lost that, and we are slipping backwards to a much earlier era, and we're repeating mistakes that and going back to things that we just know did not work and are not going to work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Daniel, can you
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Neil's given a fantastic overview. I just wonder what this bill is trying to solve. What is the problem that it's trying to solve? Because standards have gone up tremendously over time. And there are some real problems in the system that a bill could be addressing. So, for example, we've got an enormous disadvantage gap, and the coalition government really hit that hard for 7 or 8 years and introduced a pupil premium. Why aren't we addressing that rather than worrying about academy freedoms? Why aren't we addressing the issue of nationally underachieving groups like white working class and Caribbean students? Why aren't we doing something about teacher retention and recruitment, where all teachers are paid on the same pay scales, even if they're computer scientists or mathematicians? So it seems to me there are a lot of things that need to be done, and the bill is an unwelcome distraction from those things that would improve the system. And, you know, the critics say, well, if you look at academies, most of the failing schools are now academies. Well, actually 80% of all schools are academies, so you would expect, if there are some schools failing, that they would be academies. But the issue has been, in terms of academy conversion, we haven't always prioritised the most successful groups to take those schools on. And one of the key reforms we could do in terms of furthering improving the academy system is to make sure that those schools, those groups with a good track record, are the ones that get the new schools. And having said all of that, there are parts of the bill that are really good. All of the stuff to do with safeguarding and introducing registers of children not in school. I mean, I can't understand why that hasn't been done before, and ensuring that where there are safeguarding issues in families, that those children, those parents need to seek permission to home educate their children. All of that's really good, but the bill is in two halves. It's the academy stuff that's the problem. And it's great that the DfE have rowed back on saying there's going to be discretion over failing schools becoming academies, but there's a second category of schools, those schools that used to be called those in serious weaknesses. Now, those schools being called requiring significant improvement, they will not automatically have to become academies, yet nevertheless they are weak schools. Why is that the case? And these new regional school improvement teams, made up of officials with some people from schools, are going to be the force that addresses underachievement in those schools. How will they do it? They'll approach multi-academy trusts and they'll ask them to go in and sort the problem out. Now, is that, or can it be as effective as having control in terms of governance, full control of leadership of a school? Well, it can't be. So I think that's a suboptimal strategy and not a good idea. I could go on about all of the other things, but there are 3 more people.
Thank you. Meg.
Thank you. And hello, I'm Meg Powell-Chandler, the director of NSN. I have been director of the New Schools Network for about 2 weeks. So this is actually my first public event. So thank you for having me. And some of these are kind of unroad tested ideas. So, you know, I'm looking for feedback from the audience. Basically, I think Bridget Phillipson has said she welcomes debate on this bill, and that is brilliant, right? She has welcomed the fact that debate is coming back into, education is coming back into the centre of debate, and I love the fact that we're talking about education. But why has it come back into the centre of debate? It's because they are breaking the consensus that has existed for the last 20 or 30 years, which is, who do we trust to improve our schools? Do we trust the people that run our schools, the people that are facing people every day and have got tried and tested methods that we know work to do so? Or do we trust bureaucrats in Whitehall to do it instead? And I think that's why this has evoked such a response, because that consensus was held through all political persuasions, from, you know, the Conservatives in the late 80s with the city technical colleges, through to Adonis in the Labour, and then the coalition years. You know, this shouldn't be party political. This is about what works for improving education. And I think that is why it has evoked such a thing. But I agree with Dan that when the government is listening, that's brilliant, and we should build on that. I mean, for those people that don't know, and it is a very illustrious audience, but the New Schools Network was set up in 2009 on the understanding that actually parents wanted change, because sometimes standards were too low. Sometimes they wanted a different type of education for their children. And Rachel will set up the New School Network to work with parents and teachers and communities to create new schools to bring about that change. And you've all got CPS things on your table. Can I just promote to you this New Schools Network Legacy Report, which is actually the impact that free schools have had, because lots of people would have heard about Michaela and the fantastic results that Michaela get, but it is not just Michaela in the free schools. There is Tahidal and what Star Academies are doing across the board. You've got Mercia up in Sheffield, you've got Dixon's. This is not just, people aren't just going for the one example. There are plenty of examples out there of actually how free schools have helped rise the tide of school standards in our country. And I just want to go on to now what this new government is doing. I agree with the government so much when Bridget Phillipson said last week, because this is a government that's never content, never complacent, never satisfied when it comes to standards in schools. We want to spread that excellence. We want to promote innovation. And it's important that we recognise the best people in doing that, the people who so often will be doing that. They are already standing in front of us, the best trusts, the best schools, the best leaders. I really agree with that. My difficulty is where I disagree with the government is I don't actually think their words and what is in the bill match. I think that they are saying things which actually people go, this is brilliant. Yeah, no, you trust academy leaders to do it. Excellent, fantastic. And then you look at actually what is in the bill, and what it is taking away freedoms. And that is a problem, because, as basically the director of an organisation that is pro-free schools, we've got a situation where they're not going to be free anymore, right? They're just going to be schools. And they have paused the innovation that is going in the system. And what is that innovation? That is looking at diverse and interesting ways to solve the teacher recruitment and retention problem. One of those free schools that's paused it. Another free school was looking at kids who do exceptionally well from disadvantaged backgrounds at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, but they're not getting into those top universities. And there were specific projects of people working together to think, we can break that, we can give these people better life chances. That is where innovation in the system is so desperately needed. That is why free schools still play a role, let alone looking at what specialist free schools have done with the maths schools that we've got across the country, with schools like Elam, which have done exceptional things with the creative arts. If it works, it works. And I would just go back to this report, which is the New School Network's Legacy Report, and I would quote Baroness Morgan, Sally Morgan, who used to be Tony Blair's political secretary, and she said, future governments, whatever their colour, will need to use all the tools at their disposal to tackle ongoing challenges. This should include supporting free schools alongside academies and maintained schools. We need to do what it takes to raise standards and life chances, and this includes continuing reform where it translates into improvement. I don't mind adding new things in to school improvement. Let's add new ideas in. I think what the problem is when you're taking those tools out of the toolbox, which have been proven to be tools which work in school improvement.
Thank you, Meg. Over to you then, Mark.
Thank you. So I'm very lucky to be back in the school system now, and I help run two lovely schools on the edge of Bedford. One is an upper school, years 9 to 11, and one is a sixth form free school with 700 students. Last summer in GCSEs, on average, the students at my upper school did an entire grade and a half worse per GCSE than my old school, Bedford Free School, did last summer. So when I stepped into the role just before the summer holiday started, I was really looking forward to getting to grips with making changes that would help to improve my upper school, which is the worst performing school in terms of progress in Bedford Borough, making it one of the best, and using the kind of things that we've learned over the last 10, 12 years since Bedford Free School opened to apply it there. And already this school's bill is making my life harder to improve that school. It's also making my life harder offering great courses at my sixth form. I'm just going to give you three great examples. My upper school, years 9 to 11, is going to expand to become a secondary school in September 2026. We're going to take in years 7 and 8. We've long been looking at how we can change the uniform to make all the new students that come to the school more welcome. I have had 4 meetings in the last week trying to get a head around the rules in uniform, which Bridget Phillipson is bringing in, that will determine exactly what we can and can't do around school uniform. Those are 3 or 4 meetings I could have spent in lessons working with colleagues to make the quality of teaching better. I could have gone out and spoken to parents to see what they thought and let them have the final say. My teachers have the final say. Bridget Phillipson will now have the final say about that. At my sixth form college, we had to break some bad news to applicants that want to come to the sixth form this September about the courses we're going to run. You can't run, if you run a sixth form, every course every year if you don't get the student numbers to do it. But one of the courses that was totemic for us was the BTEC in engineering. We've taken the decision we're not going to run engineering for a bit because we can't be sure where we're going to find engineering teachers from. Because if any of you know about engineering teachers, most of them don't come in with qualified teacher status. They've had a great career in the sector already. They're coming in generally when they're a bit older. They want to get on and do the job. The last thing they want to do is put themselves through QTS. It wasn't the only reason why we decided not to run that engineering course, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. So already before the ban on unqualified teachers in state schools comes in, it's having an impact on the range of great courses I can offer students in my sixth form. And finally, the other way that these reforms are really hammering school improvement already in this country is around the curriculum. There is no doubt the curriculum that my two schools are offering is not terrible, but it could be a whole lot better. You and I know the curriculum is the core of what a school offers. What you teach students is the most important thing you do. It's your core product. I'd love to get going on a curriculum review. Indeed, I am going to launch a curriculum review across both of my schools after February half term. So we can take our time to really think about what is the best that's been thought, said and done, and how do we teach our youngsters about it. But rightly, I've got colleagues saying to me, we can't do that now. We need to wait and see what Bridget Phillipson thinks is the best that's been thought, said and done as part of her curriculum and assessment review. So already it's holding it up. So these are massive problems. They're already having a practical impact on schools right now. But my final thing I wanted to say was we have to accept that Bridget Phillipson has every right to do this. They won that election fair and square. People like myself, when we were working in the think tank, warned people what was going to happen. This is only what they told us they were going to do. Those of us that were in the political operation within the DfE before the election were very clear about what Labour would do if they got into government. They won that argument. They're pushing it through. But just because they can doesn't mean they should. And so I'd be urging the political team in the Department for Education and in number 10 to stop, think really hard about all the feedback they're getting from people in the sector on the front line who are actually having to put this into practice day in, day out, and pause. Heaven knows, we dumped a school bill a couple of years ago that wasn't working out because we knew it wasn't going to land well. There'd be no shame in dropping the schools bit of the Children's Wellbeing in Schools bill, which we have in Parliament right now, because at its heart, the schools bit of the schools bill is going to undermine the children's wellbeing bit. It's already doing it now.
Thank you, Mark. So I think we've heard some really interesting and insightful remarks from all of our speakers there. I'm sure the audience have got many great questions. I think there's a couple of things I'd like the panel to discuss first. And it strikes me that one theme that sort of cropped up in every utterance was the consensus has broken down, the cross-party consensus that existed for 20 or 30 years. How do we go about rebuilding that consensus? Is this something that needs to be teacher-led? What's the role of politicians in that? And perhaps maybe Daniel or Mark can start on that as people at the front line.
How do we rebuild the consensus? Goodness me, that's a really difficult one. If some people fundamentally don't believe in the primacy of initiatives that lead to freedom, and if they have a producer interest as their priority rather than the child interest, and if you look at the National Education Union, the leadership of are absolutely delighted with this bill, very hard. If those people are in the ascendancy with influence, I don't mean to be negative, it's very hard to find a way around that in terms of building consensus.
If I could add something just a little bit more positive on that, it's really interesting that some of the most impactful contributions to the debate around the schools bill have come from both people in the sector who just know what they're talking about, and people indeed on the Labour side who remember, right, why these things are put in place. And everyone in this room obviously knows what Chesterton's fence is. You know, there's a fence there for a reason. And if you don't know why the fence was put there, then you get into trouble. And there's a lot of things like that in the bill. So I thought Siobhan McDonough, who's a Labour MP down in Mitcham and Modern, stood up in the second reading and she said, you know, we had a school, we tried to turn around, we tried to turn into Harris Academy, actually, funnily enough. Two of them. And for 2 years, they were dragged through the courts with the kids in that school, still stuck. Everyone knew that they needed new management and new leadership, but 2 years of grievance from all the usual campaign groups and left-wing blah, 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 blah. And those who remember why these things were done. I thought there was a great quote. Ministers keep quoting, saying what we're interested in is, we're not interested in structural reforms or these theoretical think tanky ideas. We're interested in standards, not structures. And I thought, I'm sure I've heard that before. And so I consulted the manual, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Blair's biography, in which he says of this statement, we'd come to power in 1997 saying it was standards, not structures, that mattered. Unfortunately, as I began to realize once experience shaped our thinking, it was bunkum as a piece of policy. And he's so right about that, right? These things, they sound very abstract. Oh, what we need is, to quickly rebroker failing schools. We need to have a combination of competition and cooperation. They all sound very abstract, but ultimately, right, we can see it worked. We can see that it worked, and it didn't work in Wales. And I'd love to hear one day an account from someone in the current government of why they think things have gone so wrong in Wales. It's not ethnicity, it's not poverty, it is the lack of the structural reforms that worked in England. And some people in Labour realise that, and I just hope that at some point they will make their voices heard.
And I also think that, in general, people are either ideologically with you, ideologically against you, or they just don't know. And I think that the great thing about school reform is that you've had lots of high agency people who have wanted to make a difference and improve life chances for people, get involved in education through becoming teachers, starting free schools, getting involved in some way. We have, there is power there. We have power to influence, to share that. And actually, to think that parents don't have skin in this game is a mistake. To think that teachers don't have skin in this game is a mistake. And actually, there is a wider consensus, but we need to do more to tell the story about if people don't, if people see something works versus something doesn't work, they're going to go, if they don't have an ideology to get in the way for the thing that works. So we need to be louder and we need to be prouder about telling the story about what works, how it works, and showing the benefits that both children get from that in terms of a better education and teachers get from that in terms of better teacher retention, better teacher recruitment, better experience in the classroom.
Does anyone on the panel have any hope of a big Labour U-turn on this later in this Parliament then, once they've seen the results? Or
But I think that part of the win, if you call it a win, about kind of getting them to put the amendment in about floor not ceiling was it was clear that they weren't 100% sure what they were saying they were doing. So if ultimately that is true for other parts of the bill, then it is beholden on people like me and us who think that actually what they're saying and what they're doing do not match, to explain that to them, to show them ways in which, and offer amendments to show that actually you want to do this is actually how you would do it in law. And so I remain hopeful, but I also don't think that just because we've got the amendment around teacher pay, we should stop there. I think we should keep going. I think it shows that actually there is more road to run on this.
The impact of things on education is a bit like the impact on savings or pensions. They're a long-term thing. You don't see the upside or the downside for a long time. So that's why for such a long time, people said, go and look at Finland in terms of how great they were doing. And actually, they'd already dismantled the things that were great and they were getting much worse. Obviously, SPAD omerta means I can't talk about certain things from my time in the department and what I'm seeing now. What I will say is it's quite clear the political operation in the DfE is shambolic. They haven't got to grip with the policy side of stuff, and they haven't got to grip with the bill side of stuff. The fact that bill came out the way it was drafted, clearly ministers had not been properly talked through the impact of that bill. Some of us have horrific memories about going through a similar process a few years ago. But the fact that they don't have political control can be seen in a number of things. There's announcements coming up that they weren't aware would be massively unpopular, but they were. They generally thought the Latin thing would be okay, that no one would notice. That shows a real lack of understanding of how those things land. The fact that they hadn't thought through the detail of the pay scale thing is huge. But again, like anyone with a little bit of knowledge about how it works in schools would know that would be a problem there. And again, this school improvement, the RISE team things, as soon as you drill into how few people it is, it's like 3 or 4 people per region at the most, and they're largely just rebrokering. And if there's one thing the DfE is not good at, it's brokering and procurement. And yet they're basing their school improvement strategy on something which is based on brokering and procurement.
Can I ask a question, actually? How many... Obviously, all your teachers are working on school improvement, but how many people work on sort of school improvement in Harris, roughly?
We've got a central force of 100 subject experts, and they work across our 55 schools leading their subjects. But I mean, the expectation is people like us will be brokered to provide support to other schools in trouble. And of course, we want to help, but what happens when we take those supports away from our own schools? We don't carry surplus people in case the government might ask us to. And I'm sure this is true of other multi-academy trusts as well. So there's a tension there. It assumes there's a lot of excess capacity, and there isn't necessarily.
I only just to mark that for the audience. So the team that the government is currently relying on to drive all improvement from the centre, right, from central government, is currently 20 people. So you alone, as one school trust, have 5 times more people than them focused on this kind of expertise. I mean,
And Dan's experts are held accountable for the impact they have on his schools, whereas these RISE people will not be held accountable for the impact they do or don't have on their schools. I mean, accountability within the civil service is really hard at the best of times. It's not make a blind bit of difference whether they have an impact on those schools or not.
oh, there's so much to say about the RISE team thing. I mean, you will find conflicts as well where people are sent into a school and the people who are in charge of that school, a trust, want to do one thing, and the people who've been sent in as a sort of troubleshooters from central government think another. And it's not clear to me who's supposed to win in that scenario. And so we've had the shift from school-led school improvement to an attempt at centrally-led school improvement. And I feel like we have been here before with a lot of different schemes, and there's a reason why we ended up under New Labour and then under...
But also, we've tried it under the Conservatives. There was a point under Sir David Carter, who has come out. Sir David Carter was no fan of the Conservatives towards the end of the Conservative government, if you followed him on social media, and could not be more delighted with the new government. Even he's come out and attacked what they're doing. And he was the guy that wanted to turn the regional schools commissioners into the school improvement army in the school system. And yet we recognised in the end it didn't work, because it broke down the link between accountability and the people, the accountability for improving schools and the people that are paying to do it, and that kind of stuff. It just hasn't worked. So that was only 6, 7, 8 years ago. That's like within...
There was a large-scale initiative about 20 years ago called the Beacon School Initiative, where great schools were given extra money to support other schools. And the upshot of that was it didn't work, and a lot of public money was wasted, because where a school leadership was weaker, they either didn't want to take the advice on because they didn't want to do what was necessary, or they couldn't. And in those situations, it had no effect, because the advisors didn't have a grip on the school in the same way they would if it was a school joining your multi-academy trust, where you're responsible for governance.
And the original chief exec of Outward Grange would talk about how they used to do lots of school improvement work, and then they turned and said, why don't we just take these schools on? Rather than being paid to turn them around, give them to us, don't give us any extra money, and we'll do a better job. And guess what? They did. I mean, like, literally, the system we have now is built on what didn't work, figuring out what works. And for some reason, Bridget and co think they know better. And that's what I just want to know why they think they know better than everything that's gone on the last 15, 20 years.
Right. So I think one point that came in our discussion earlier was, what an opportunity cost this is to be addressing all the other problems that you could be looking at. And one of these long-standing problems in schools, of course, has been recruitment and retention. I mean, how much worse could this potentially make that?
So we've already said I think I read David Thomas shared some of it. The flow of unqualified teachers into the profession is between 600 and 700 a year. Not huge, but the impact on the stock of teachers over time, that's pretty substantial. And actually, it's in particular subjects, particularly computing, engineering, and actually some of the design, technology, textile, stuff like that. So that's definitely going to have an impact within months as soon as that law is passed. Not only that, it's going to make it, if you're an existing unqualified teacher in a school, you will be allowed to move. They said they probably will allow you to move to another job, but at that point you have to promise you'll get the new qualified teacher status. So the bargaining power for existing unqualified teachers have been massively reduced. So that can't be a good thing.
I mean, I think the name unqualified teacher is such a sort of misnomer in lots of cases, because these people who are coming in who have got incredible experience, much more than a lot of people who've got the QTS. So, for example, Rebecca Leake, who's a head teacher down in Suffolk, came and spoke to us during the build committee, and she said, I was short at the start of the term of early years lead, and so I got someone who didn't have QTS, but she'd run like basically the most successful nursery in town. Right, so this person is technically, in the eyes of the law, an unqualified teacher, but actually like way more qualified than anyone else you're going to find to do that. And she wouldn't have been able to do that with the kind of reforms that are now being put through. So I do think it will make it hard, exactly as Mark says, to bring in those people who they come to the end of their career or coming towards it. They want to give something back. You're a brilliant engineer. You're a brilliant IT person. You want to go into school. But there's a big difference between something being hassle-free and not hassle-free. You can go and like give back at the local private school. That's fine. There's no obstacle to you doing that. But there will be the same obstacle. There will be an obstacle if you want to do it in the state system. And that seems to me, you say, oh, you might want to go through the process of getting QTS and it's fine. But if you make things harder for people, less people do it and fewer people do it. And that seems to me just a shame.
Yeah, it seems like it will have a chilling effect on people who might come in and do it. But I also think it gives, the population at large inaccurate view of what an unqualified teacher is. It suggests that someone with literally no qualification is just like let loose on a classroom, and there is no kind of support either from the people that employed them, or potentially doing their own training modules irrespective of the qualification that happened. I mean, especially in free schools, one of the findings that this wonderful report showed was the way that free schools are able to get exceptionally good results is that they recruit to the culture and the ethos that the school is set up with, on the understanding that you can't teach someone a culture or an ethos, but you can support them to be a better teacher, or gain kind of the way in which you can pass on learning. And so I think that's quite an interesting kind of concept when you think of actually how to do whole school improvement, and actually how to create a proper culture within a school to whatever culture the school wants to create. It's not just about a PGCE or a early careers framework kind of QTS. It's about actually, do you believe in the mission and the purpose of the institution that you're standing in, and are you willing to imbue that with all of your actions in front of a classroom?
But I think insisting that all teachers should have qualified teacher status is addressing a problem that doesn't exist. There are a relatively small number of teachers that don't have qualified teacher status. And in our group, it's people who come in their 50s and they're scientists and they want to teach A-level physics, and we can't find a physicist, and they've got brilliant subject knowledge, or someone with medical experience. So there's not a problem being caused in the system by lots of unqualified teachers. It's a niche business that solves a problem, and it's a soundbite thing, but I don't think it's fixing a real issue. Whereas the whole recruitment and retention thing affecting the rest of the profession is massive, and that's what needs policy looking at.
I think the actual stats are something like in academies it's 3.5% of people don't have QTS, and in maintained schools where you're meant to have QTS it's 2.9%. So there's also, like, if you're going to do it, you're also going to implement it to make sure that people do have it. Seems very strange.
It's also randomly then not applying to various, it doesn't apply to UTCs or studio schools or 14 to 19 academies or 16 to 19 academies or various other types of schools. So the government is in a bizarre position of saying it's absolutely essential we impose this on all schools. We cannot have any deviation from it, apart from the following massive list of deviations where it's more heavily used. So it's,
which shows they hadn't thought it through.
It's
they
just a mess. That came out in that we only discovered that by reading footnote like 24 of it's completely buried in the detail. And as we're doing the bill committee, you can see ministers getting bits of paper from the officials, and they're learning about their own bill in front of your very own eyes, which is always, having sat in that seat, is always an unsettling experience as a minister when you discover something about what you are putting into legislation.
I mean, it sounds to me like there's sort of, if we're thinking about what are the beliefs or the values or the philosophy that is underpinning Labour's education policy at the moment, credentialism is an issue there, anti-elitism. I mean, I'd be interested in what the panel thinks. What is the ideological perspective on this?
If I can chip in with one, I think one of the biggest unexploded issues in the bill is clause 50 of the bill. And it's such a big change of principle. I think it's a good example of your question. So I mentioned that Mrs. Thatcher in the late 80s, when her government finally turned to the issue of public service reform, started to introduce the principles of choice and competition that she'd applied to the rest of the economy. And getting rid of the local authority veto of a good schools expanding was, of course, essential part of that. So there could be more good school places. Parents vote with their feet. That creates a massive motor for improvement. And we've all become very used to that. But that principle, which is pretty normal part of most free societies, is not something everyone shares. And if you're from a more social democratic point of view, or indeed if you work at the Treasury, you think, oh, this is creating surplus school places, or it's wasteful competition. What we need to do is have a new vehicle so that not parents decide which schools grow and extend. We need to change that round so that local authority councillors decide which schools get to open. And this is a hugely radical part of the bill. No one has really talked about it much yet. It's been in the Times over the weekend. But instead of you being able to expand or being able to stay the same as a school leader in the future, your local authority, or indeed any local authority in the entire country, can challenge your admission number and say, no, I think you should shrink. And that's particularly relevant because in London and other urban areas, there's going to be the start of a big decline in primary school numbers, which will start to feed through into secondary schools. And in some London authorities, quite a few of them, you'll see more than either 1 in 10 or 1 in 8 even. Primary school pupils disappeared in just the next 4 years. So there's a challenge, right? There'll be a challenge for some schools. Who gets to decide which ones grow and which ones shrink or even close? Should it be parents through parental choice, or should it be the local authority? And not only do I think that this is bad because there's no principles put in the bill around how you make this choice, right? There's nothing to say, well, you should particularly preserve the better schools or the schools that are most in demand from parents. There's none of that. You also have this right for one local authority to challenge the numbers, the intake of a school in another local authority. So in London, they'll all be challenging each other, and you'll say, well, your school is creating a problem for my school. I want to keep my sixth form open. Yours needs to shrink. And indeed, for ideological reasons, Luther Rahman, the independent mayor of Tower Hamlets, suddenly has the right to challenge the admission numbers for any school in my constituency. And where people have strong views on issues of faith schools or selection, all of those issues will get tangled up with this as well. And there's an extraordinary piece of reasoning in the notes, the government's own notes to the bill, where they say, well, if a school's intake is threatening another school or making it difficult for another school, and then you start to think about how you apply that logic in a city like London that's got 2,800 state schools in it. How do I know that the issues for my struggling school are being caused by your successful school rather than just my own school, or indeed one of the other 2,799 schools somewhere in the vicinity, right? The logic, as soon as you start to think about it, becomes very messy and very complicated. And the reason I don't think this unexploded bomb has been thought through is I don't think it's been not thought through. And this point about competition and choice, I just don't think is.
So it's terrible for families. This could have been a golden age for school choice for families if we'd allowed the natural population to decline, which is happening. And then if you think it through, it would have been people like me and Dan that would have been the bad guys. We would have taken the bad news, having to decide which of our schools we kept open and which schools we didn't. Who's going to be blamed every time a school closes now? It's going to work its way all the way up through the political hierarchy to Bridget. So now Bridget Phillipson and her successors, because she may not come out of this unscathed, this process, if I was, I'd be very worried. A lot of ministers' time is going to be bogged down in having to rule on these different decisions once the school adjudicator can't get to the bottom of it. So again, rather than getting to the achievement gap between the haves and the have-nots, between the consistent underperformance of white working class and Afro-Caribbean kids and so on and so forth, Bridget Phillipson and ministers are going to have to get bogged down deciding which school stays open and which school's closed, instead of getting onto the really, really substantive issues.
And there's no right of appeal to this, by the way. So when the adjudicator decides, that could be the end of your school. They can set the pan to 0, right? So they can shut schools. And they can also stop schools from opening. You come along with your cool, maybe you're Michaela, and you think about all the obstacles they faced to opening in the first place and all the resistance from local authorities and local politicians. Well, you push for their pan to be 0. Oh, we don't need more competition in our area. We don't need, you say you'll give new good school places. I don't want new people coming in.
But it goes one step beyond that, because up until now, local authorities have not been able to open new schools. New schools have had to be academies. The bill is proposing that local authorities will open new schools. So you'll have local authorities making decisions on which schools should reduce their numbers, and they won't be disinterested, because they'll theoretically be able to open their own schools, and they'll be deciding between schools that are academies and their own. There are bound to be difficulties there.
To be conflicts of interest as well. I mean, someone summarised once the 3 laws of thermodynamics as you can't win, you will lose, and you can't stay out of the game. And in the bill, you have local authorities get to open new schools. We stop turning failing schools at local authority schools into academies, and we give local authorities the power to object to the size of any school, right? Take those 3 things together, and what have you got? You've got really kind of the end of those principles of competition and choice that have been guiding the system since 1988. It's a huge change.
At a time when local authorities don't really seem to be calling out for this power, don't seem to be saying, I really want to start a new school, are saying that they are facing huge budget pressures themselves, and Angela Rayner is seeking to reorganise the whole thing by I don't really know when. So it's a hot mess meeting a hot mess. And the problem is with all of what we're saying is there's the politics, there's the what works, what doesn't work. At the end of this, it's children trying to get an education, and it's beholden on us. We have the moral duty to make that the best education physically possible. And we can get, this is at the heart of all of this, and it's why it's so important. And it is kind of, school systems are technical and difficult and really tricky, but don't mess around with it if you don't know what you're doing.
And at the same time as they're messing around with it, they're going to make it harder for us to assess whether schools are getting better or worse over time, because they're going to change the accountability measures. We don't have a progress measure for the next 2 years anyway for secondaries because of COVID. They're looking to change what goes into the progress aid and the attainment aid measures. They've completely revamped the way Ofsted do things. So it's going to be very hard to tell if this is working or not for a long time anyway. So they're changing the rules of the game and the way we're measuring it all at the same time.
Oh, you've all unpicked the complexity of this wonderfully, but that's a very depressing picture we've painted there. I think we'll go to the audience now for questions. I'll ask that questions are kept fairly short so we can get quite a few. Okay, this gentleman here.
Hello.
Sorry, microphone's coming around.
Absolutely. Nick Hargrave, used to work in government, now work in consultancy. Everyone on the panel's pretty united that the bill's rubbish, and most people in this room probably agree exactly the same thing. It's probably going to come on the statute book in some force, might be slightly less bad. It's probably going to come on in some way, given the numbers in Parliament. So my question is, what does the campaign to overturn it look like? And the second question, how does the Conservative Party tie that into an argument for the future of the centre-right in this country?
Good question. Neil?
If I may pick up, so the campaign continues in the Commons. We've got the next day of Bill Committee tomorrow. We then have report stage. I can see the people from the Lords here this evening, so the campaign will continue there where the government doesn't have a majority. And I think there are so many problems in this bill that the most centrist of peers may find themselves tempted to vote against some of the things in here. And I know that the government suffered a defeat the other day on their IFATE bill in the Lords, so it's possible. And I think there is a more general point there about restarting the discussion about public service reform. There are some appalling statistics out this morning from the Office for National Statistics showing that public sector productivity has absolutely collapsed. And, for example, in the health service hasn't really grown at all since 1997. And that's obviously just unsustainable for us as a country. We can't have public services only get better if you put in more and more and more resources, never greater. And so that conversation, which I think dried up, if I'm going to be self-critical, at the end of the last government, needs to massively restart. We need the input from every single think tank and a campaign group, because ultimately, this is an aging society. There are going to be ever greater pressures on the public finances, and unless we learn to become more productive, to do things better, there's always a case for more money for things, but you've got to also be more effective too, and that's the real art. And in schools, the thing is, we had quite a lot of the right pieces in place. I think we could have gone lots further, and I think there's much more to do. But getting back to the basic arguments about why giving parents choice empowers the raising of standards, and remaking these arguments, which are a bit abstract for people, they're not as simple as like, I'll make you do this and that'll improve it like that. The argument has to be re-won.
The only thing I would say, I don't want this to become about the centre-right. Actually, one of the really beautiful things about the last 15 years, which when I was involved in school reform, was it didn't matter whether you came from the left or the right. Most people involved just wanted to run really great schools. And one of the incredible things that really took off under Team Gove in opposition, and then those first 2 years of being in government, was whether it was free schools or the academisation movement or what. It wasn't a left or right thing. So actually, I think in terms of school reform, we don't need to make it about the centre-right, but right now it seems like it's only the centre-right that are prepared to have that debate. We mustn't make it about the centre-right.
Yeah, and I'm actually more positive, because I think, realising in why we're here is only as useful as it helps to inform how we go forward and change it, right? So irrespective of why the bill is the way the bill is, what has happened is Bridget Phillipson has started engaging a lot more with the sector. That is good. We should utilise that. What is changing is the fact that people are sitting up and noticing this. I think as school leaders and teachers and parents, we all have a voice about the importance of these issues in the education of our children and our society. We are not voiceless in this, and therefore the campaign, I think, is always more powerful when you're hearing people like Dan who have got the experience of actually turning around schools to do that. I would encourage anyone who's got a voice in education that feels strongly about this to speak up. And I'd also, the thing that makes me concerned here is the opportunity cost, not just for the things that the Department for Education should be done, but the improvement in education that we might see if we weren't doing these things. And I think, parents are, if they think that this education their children are getting is good at this moment, they've got skin in this game as well. And I think that we need to do more to engage them and explain to them the difference it's going to have and the impact it's going to have on their children's education, because there is nothing quite like informed and motivated parents who, the thing that they care about is their children and their children's future. And that is a powerful thing to be able to utilise.
Right, more questions? The lady down at the front, please.
Thank you. My name is Ruchi. I'm a computer science teacher. I came from industry and I do have QTS. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was, what do you think impact this bill would have on behaviour? Because I think the school's ability to manage behaviour is fundamental to its success and also retention. I know I go into different schools and I know that the schools where the behaviour is appalling, the staff are obviously the leadership team are trying to turn it around. But it's really challenging. And one of the big things that people never talk about is parenting. I think we need to also talk about how people need to be better parents to their children, because that's transfers directly to school, where if it's the first time you've got boundaries, then that becomes a challenge for the school to deal with. So how do you think this bill is going to impact behaviour?
Certainly there's a category of school that previously would have automatically become an academy. They were called schools in serious weaknesses. They will no longer become academies. They're now called schools requiring significant improvement, and they'll get intervention from these RISE teams over a 2-year period. I suspect we'll see that things won't improve as quickly in those schools because the Multi-Academy Trust hasn't got the grip on improving them. That category of schools, certainly, and there are a number out there. However, on the converse, the government has done one thing, which is proposing one thing which is quite useful. There are schools that are known as stuck schools, schools that are regularly rated as requires improvement. And the last government, I think, debated what to do with them, but didn't actually have a proactive policy. At least under this new bill, they're suggesting they get some intervention. So that category of 600 schools through that may benefit. The more seriously failing schools may not.
I think one of the interesting things about the bill is that it's completely silent on discipline, right? Every poll, teacher tap polls and stuff like that, show you that it's one of the top issues facing people who actually work in it. And yet the bill has nothing to say about it, which I think is just extraordinary. I mean, we do have a bunch of amendments down to it. I mean, one of them, which we'll hopefully debate tomorrow, is to require all acts of violence against teachers to be reported to police. People want to go to work in a safe environment. Normal people, if you're another professional, if you're a doctor or whatever, you wouldn't expect to have to be a punching bag, and teachers shouldn't expect teachers should not be expected to be any different, right? So we have various measures down about discipline, because there are issues there. And if you look at what's happening in Scotland, I mean, it is extraordinary where you haven't had all these reforms. Teachers in Scotland are on strike over discipline because they don't feel like the people who run schools in Scotland have their back. And that is just an appalling condemnation of some of the things that have happened up there. Terrible ideas on behaviour imposed from the government. And the result is that both pupils and teachers lose out in a big way. I mean, one of the other things about discipline and order in schools that we have as an amendment to the bill, which so far the government is resisting, is an amendment to properly ban phones from our schools. And DfE as an institution have always been resistant to this, and so it's very complicated and blah, 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 blah. But the evidence, I think, is pretty clear that it works. There's good randomized control trials that show it's good for educational achievement. And why does it not happen? Well, a lot of schools get grief from parents, and some difficult people say, "Oh, little Johnny's got to have, his smartphone on him all the time, and I want to be." And you can see from the DfE's own surveys that even despite the guidance that has been put out there, huge numbers of lessons are still disrupted by people with their phones out. A lot of schools have weak policies where you're not supposed to have it out, but then of course kids fiddle with it. And only about 1 in 10 schools has a proper end-to-end ban. And that, if you're at all interested in all things that Jonathan Haidt's been writing about the impact on young people of the shift to a smartphone-based childhood and some of the problems that's causing in our schools, mental health and everything else, that is it's partly about behaviour and discipline as well. And I do think that in the end, I don't really understand why the government is resisting this. I think it's weird for a government that is happy to micromanage, what colour jumper you're wearing and whether you can put up a bike shed, but they don't want to do something where it would be useful to have schools' backs and allow schools to slightly hide behind the big bad government and just say, look, we've got to do this, put your phones away in school. So anyway, we've got some measures, but it's creating an incredible omission. How have we got a schools bill that is totally silent on basically one of the biggest issues facing our schools? Mad.
Right, so the gentleman down on the second row.
Is it too late to use the Education Select Committee to help educate the 167 or so Labour backbenchers who are the, quotes, real opposition on the changes needed? I ask that question because Helen Hayes is my local MP, and she has asked for topics to put to the Education Select Committee, and discipline withdrawal of the schools officers is one of the topics that our local Labour councillors want Helen to help organise a petition for all the South London Labour MPs to get involved with. There is clearly discontent, there's clearly an opportunity, but given the state of the legislative scrutiny, is it too late to use that as a channel?
Well, Labour MPs are going to find themselves voting on some of this stuff in a couple of weeks' time when we hit report stage. And I think that will make some of them aware of some of the problems when you have to first go through the lobby to vote for it and then explain to your constituents why you did it. And often found that that made us uncomfortable when we were in government, and the same will be true of some measures here. I hope the Select Committee can do everything it can to put some of these issues onto the agenda. Obviously, we have a tiny number of people on it, and the government got a huge majority. But as we discovered in the last Parliament, even though you have a majority, it doesn't mean that things can't move very quickly. And when you have the kind of criticism of this bill that you've had from so many people in the sector, it's not us. All I do is read out what people in the sector are saying, right? In a sense, my job is just a middleman. I do think you have to listen at some point if you've got any common sense.
And the thing is, it's a very big bill. Right, it's a very big bill, and I'm sure some of you also enjoyed watching the entirety of the second reading debate in the House of Commons when this came forward. And the majority of the Labour people that stood up and spoke about the well-being aspect of the bill, like precisely because there is a lot of good stuff in there, and they were proud of it, and that was good. But I actually think it was only 2 Labour MPs who spoke about the schools part of the bill, and one of them was against. So I think that, again, that's why I'm hopeful, because I think that ultimately it's about explaining to them and making sure that they do know the facts of what is going on here, and actually how strongly people feel about it, because it clearly is something that people care about.
Any more questions? Have the lady over here, please.
I've been chairman of governors at a number of schools. Maybe I've been unlucky, but I haven't found this consensus over recent decades. I think the education blob is just sleeping, and there's been huge hostility in all the schools in trying to get the reforms accepted. There's hostility to testing, to these exams, to curriculum, and to academies as well, for those of us still in council community schools. So I think they're just throwing up their hands with joy and see the bill as the top of the slipperyest slope. Yeah, there may be been a political consensus, but I think it now has to get political, and because otherwise the Marxists, and they are Marxists, a lot of the people, and certainly lefties among the teachers, are going to destroy everything, and it's just hard not to despair, really.
I think the consensus was more around, well, it's okay in a democracy for the government to will the outcomes, to determine what they want schools to do, because ultimately they fund us. But how schools choose to make their schools safe and orderly, teach kids to read and write, to behave, and to do well in exams and core bits of curriculum, how you do that, the consensus is what we're going to leave schools to do. And there will always be differences as to what the purpose of schooling is and what the philosophy behind education is. Because if we asked all of you in here, what's the purpose of education, you'd all have a slightly different way of explaining it and different things you thought more important, and that's okay. What's changed with this bill, what this bill challenges is, they're now going to will the means as well as the outcome. And that's a huge change. And I don't think quite... Lots of discomfort I've picked up, my political allegiances are quite clear because of previous jobs I've done. Most people in teaching don't vote that way, didn't vote that way last year. The amount of fear that people have got, but they won't come out and say it because they generally didn't think that their own people would do this to them, and it's happening. The main reason why more than won't speak out, unlike Dan and just a couple of other academy leaders, is because they're scared of the political consequences of speaking out against their paymasters.
I would just say as well, I completely agree with you in terms of actually there have been at times pitched battles about improving education. And it again goes back to how important this is. People really, really care. But I would again divide the world into people who are ideologically pro, ideologically against. And the way that we can win this is by mobilizing the people in the middle who are driven by actually, what does data say? What do outcomes say? How can we show people what works? And we all have a role in that, right? We all have a voice in that. And so, you know, if you care about this and you're motivated by this conversation, when you leave this place tonight, think about, well, how can I use that voice? Who can I speak to? How can I raise this up the flagpole? Because it, you know, again, Dan has been very brave about talking out about this, as has others. But if people talk about this, we get the attention on it, and it allows us to actually have the debate and try and convince the people who actually don't really have a strong opinion either way, or else it is going to be a shouting match between people that, you know, ultimately will never get on.
And by the way, well done on you for being a school governor. I've been a school governor, chair of school governors, and one of the things you really noticed doing the job was the torrent of paper that came from DFE towers and sanctuary buildings. And funnily enough, actually, and this was mainly under the last Labour government, there are people who do want freedom in the system as well. It's true that a lot of the things in the bill are the old wish lists of people who've never liked reform. It's true. But there are a lot of people in the system who have valued those freedoms and liked being able to get on with their jobs and do the thing that they came into teaching to do, which is teach rather than comply with whatever the latest ministerial whim is. And I think that as the consequences of this become apparent, that will, there are a lot of people out there who are in favour of reform in the school system. And there are a lot of people in fairness who've been critical of this bill. I mean, if you think about just one thing, the end of the Academy's order, being criticised by the former schools commissioner, the children's commissioner, the Confederation of School Trusts, loads of individual school leaders, been criticised by a Labour MP. You know, there's a lot of people out there who get that this stuff is a mistake. So I'm less despairing than some, and I think that as people have the consequences of micromanagement again, they will remember why they don't really like it. I hope so too.
Right, we've got time for another couple of questions.
There's a lady here.
Hi, thanks. I think everything that's been said so far has been really interesting. Since I've been preparing like readings and reading up on the schools bill, the one thing that has been giving me the most kind of aggro in terms of what I want to know more about is the idea that the standardization will change. Trade unions are apparently against it. But Bridget has said that she's all for it. So she's kind of made a shift to say that I'm not controlled by trade unions, etc. But I want to know what the thoughts are from people that actually have to deal with it in terms of what are your opinions on Ofsted having their single word ratings, and how do you feel in the fact that you're going to have to prepare these reports and have a bigger categorization in terms of how well you're doing? And then also, how do you feel about the fact that local authorities will have more impact in terms of how you run your schools? Because local authorities are obviously in a tricky situation in terms of the money, the kind of findings. We see Mid-Devon have in a situation where they're saying that if kids are being excluded, we're going to fine schools £21,000. So how do you feel about all of that in terms of, are you working with councils? Are you not working with councils? Are they holding you back? Or what is the general consensus there?
Two good questions there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Start with the second one. We've got schools in about 15 London boroughs, and the relationship with councils varies by borough. In some boroughs, we cooperate with all of the boroughs on child protection and safeguarding. We're required to, and we should do, and it's right. And we're part of the hard to place panels in those boroughs. Some boroughs we have very little relationship with the councils. In others we work closely. It just depends on how they want it to be. But of our 55 schools, 2/3 of them came in as schools that have been failed by those councils. They're now mostly outstanding schools, and you know, local democracy is really important. And I saw a Labour MP's response to the bill today, and her rationale was part of the bill is making sure academies are accountable. Well, academies should be accountable, but all of those failing schools were failed by the councils that ran them. and nobody there showed any accountability. I never saw any counsellors lose their jobs. Whereas if we get it wrong, there's a lot of accountability. And going back to Ofsted, probably making myself very unpopular, I thought having a single overall grade was a good thing. I wasn't keen to see that be removed because I think it's clear. And as somebody said recently, if 2 Ofsted teams go into a school, they're more likely to agree that the school overall is good than they are to agree on 8 or 11 subgrades. But once you move away from a single overall grade, you necessarily enter a much more complex system. And one of the good things is we've got a great new chief inspector who ran a very good multi-academy trust, Martin Oliver, and his consultation, he says, and I've got every faith in this, that he's open to listening, and hopefully the sector will feedback, and there is a lot of feedback at the moment. I'm sure Ofsted will listen. So what we're looking at now isn't necessarily what will come out the other end of the sausage machine.
On the Ofsted thing, I think it also just shows the difficulty of when you don't have 2 things which you're trading off against by saying you're not going to have a single word discount and then having that space between the single word and then the alternative. You're not actually allowing people to actually say, well, if you don't like single word, this might be what you do instead. If you're not able to kind of see them next to each other. And I think that the difficulty is you've also now got this period, this very bizarre period of time where you don't have that single word and you're not 100% sure what the new system is. And I think, in a system where we would like to empower parents to make the right choices for their children, that is obviously a strange limbo to be in.
It does seem a bit like one of these things where your granny gets you a terrible present that you didn't really want. So it doesn't seem to have made anyone very happy. So on the one hand, I think it's more complicated for parents because you're going to have to decipher this very complicated sort of Tetris-like grid. I understand the logic of it, but I do think it is more difficult for parents to navigate. And on the other hand, only about 6% of teachers are happy with it in the poll. So it hasn't made those who had concerns about the previous rate system happy either. But my concerns are more really about, less about what Ofsted have come up with, which I'm not particularly going to go out of my way to criticise, but more what the government is doing about the way it then intervenes on the basis of those things. And as Dan has said, for the half of the schools that are failing, they will now get put in the process of not getting on with the business of being put into a really good trust, which is what they need, but instead going through 18 months, and that's 18 months before potentially a year or 2-year period in which they're then academised, in which they're being sort of managed remotely by these RISE teams, and they're, I think, going to be inspected something like 5 times. And I think if I was a teacher, what would I prefer? Would I prefer to be part of a really good trust where people come in and we are part of one family and we're all helping each other, we're all in the same team and they've got loads of expertise? Or would I rather have someone who comes once in a while, is a sort of expert, but is not part of us, and we get inspected an awful lot? Would I want to go and teach in that school if I was a young teacher, or would I want to go and teach somewhere else where things were easier? So I've got a lot of doubts about the idea of centrally led school improvement compared to the previous system of school-led school improvement, where there was funding and powers for the best mats to grow, and also, as it were, resources out there for you to pull down on, be it on teaching maths or computing or physics or whatever. Resources are now being pulled away to have that centralisation instead. So I think that's where the real problem is, rather than what Ofsted have done necessarily.
I think what it comes down to is, who would you rather improve your kid's school, Sir Dan or someone in sanctuary buildings 200 metres away? It's a no-brainer.
It is amazing. I mean, I've had, as a constituency MP, you do see, I had a school that had a lot of problems, financial problems, things had gone really wrong there, and it got taken over by a good multi-academy trust, and it's just gone like this. It's just gone, flipped around. It's now like nearly 100% oversubscribed. People who know what they're doing, putting those guys in charge of the system, and I would put a big emphasis on that. It does make all the difference in the world, really.
And final question from lady down here.
Thanks very much. I wanted to come back to your first point about how do you build a consensus, and the remark I think you made, Meg, about, why do they think they know better? And I suppose, I think both things are true. What we've heard from all of you tonight about the excellence in the system is true, but we also know that, the best trusts are better than the best maintained schools. The worst academies are worse than the worst maintained schools, and the average academy is pretty much the same as the average maintained school. So I think part of the and both those things are true. And I would argue we need to do everything to understand what makes the good good and push everyone else to get there. But what Bridget is talking about is consistency, etc., etc. So I just wonder, and it's almost like you hear the two conversations. They're both telling the truth, but it's an entirely different view of the world. And I wonder whether to rebuild a consensus, we have to navigate and somehow, bring those two things together so that you can have a conversation which admits that there are some trusts which have grown. I'm thinking of some, diocesan trusts, for example, which weren't very strong, but the schools had to go into a diocesan trust. So I just think there's a bit where, both sides, if you like, of the argument, dance around the other's view of reality, and maybe we need to somehow open that up to get to a better way forward.
Any thoughts?
I mean, it strikes me over the years working in this sector, academies aren't the silver bullet. They provide autonomy in an environment of high accountability, and that should lead to improvement. But the idea always surely was that the DfE would make the market. And if schools weren't performing well enough, the DfE would do what a market would normally do. It would move that resource to a more efficient provider. And for me, the DfE just hasn't been good enough at doing it over the years. I get the diocesan bit, but there are many non-religious schools in that situation. And to some extent, the variation you've described, of course, it's the responsibility of academies, but also I think there's a responsibility with the department too.
And another thing is, what we know about successful multi-academy trust now is completely different to 5-6 years ago. So whereas it suits opponents of academies to lump it all together in the average, what we know is the high-performing trusts all have the same magic ingredients. They tend to be very tightly controlled over the most important things, not just HR and finance, whereas early trusts tend to be quite loose. We'll just do back office, you do your own thing. They're very clear about a consistent culture between schools, whilst giving head teachers power to control how that feels in their individual school, and so on and so on. So actually, we now know what the most successful multi-academy trusts were. The challenge was, as Dan said, that the department was never prepared to come out and say, these kind of schools work best when they're doing their rebrokering. Indeed, NSN, right up to then, before it sort of went into limbo, was still putting it there. On the one hand, McCain, and on the other hand, School 21. When those of us in the system knew for a long time, certain schools that were being held as good examples of free schools were no good for their kids there, were no good for the staff there, but we didn't want to appear to be taking sides. When those in the system knew from very early on they weren't working well.
And I think that's part of the interesting debate on this, right? Which is, I would again plug the report. But the report shows that there are a couple of principles which high-performing free schools all had in common. And it goes back to a lot of the things that the Matt said, right? It's like a common purpose, being able to recruit to that mission, kind of having really strong leaders. And I think, leadership is clearly a key thing within the entire education system, and making sure that we are able to support good leaders taking the positions to lead good schools is something which I think that should be lost on no person in terms of that importance. But the question of, if we know what works, and we've known that for a period of time, it may have taken 10 years to actually really pin down on what works. Now, if the part of the reform movement is to make sure that that is adopted as far as possible, and working out why those schools which aren't using that practice are not, I think that kind of maybe turning the conversation into that would be a part of the way to rebuild that consensus and build that consensus again. But I do slightly worry that maybe ideology might get in the way of that.
And I think, if I may, I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that in a way, the sort of public discourse is still a bit stuck pre the understanding of what makes a great trust. And therefore there's a reluctance to acknowledge that not everything, that because of the ideology, that not all academies are perfect, and they're not all the ones we've heard about tonight. And I think somehow we have to move that on, but not be tripped up, in order, because then actually that's much harder to push back against.
I think that's right. It's a bit like the argument about democracy, isn't it? It's like, it's not a perfect system, it's just the best one we've tried compared to all the others. And school freedoms not every trust is good, not every trust is amazing, and I think you're right. We should be trying to grow the best, having a kind of industrial policy for schools, as it were, trying to help those who really are replicating success at scale. And there's lots one could go into in the weeds there. But ultimately, I come back and sort of end where I started. We did the experiment a bit like in the Cold War, where we had East and West Germany, North and South Korea. You could see that one was lit up and the other one was all dark at the end of it. And we did that experiment in the UK. And I couldn't identify exactly what contribution each one of these different freedoms, each aspect of accountability made to that. But you can see that the totality of it produced very different results in different parts of the UK. And that's a powerful natural experiment that we should be learning from rather than ignoring.
And go back to the toolbox, right? You know, if you think that the spanner is better than the wrench, fine, but don't take my wrench away. Like, why not? Like, let's keep all of the tools in the toolbox. Let's not take the freedoms which might be used somewhere to improve something, even if they're not used over there to improve it. Let's not take the tools away.
Right, I'll ask the audience to join me in thanking our panelists for an incredibly insightful.
Well done. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cannot let you get away with that.